This is Lisa Henderson, editor of Applied Clinical Trials, and we're here today with Kent Tolke, Executive Vice President, Scientific and Medical Affairs for PRA International, and we're going to talk about taking advantage of a parallel drug development strategy in China with the SFDA and the U.S. and EU to save time and money. So Kent, can you explain what current strategies companies take in registering a drug in China and how this has become a de facto strategy?
Sure. Generally speaking, China has been somewhat of a mystery to most pharmaceutical and biotech companies over the last decade or so. There have been a number of pharma companies that were early adopters of China, so they've been there for well over a decade. They know China quite well. They do drug development strategies both domestically as well as part of global strategies and have been quite successful in that strategy. For most companies, most pharmaceutical and biotech companies, the challenges with the lengthy timelines for CTA approvals in China have always kind of relegated the China portion of drug development strategies to the back burner. So most companies have focused their clinical drug development, their clinical trials on the U.S., Western Europe, and slowly to Eastern Europe, and then go back to China later on after their trials have been completed and they've filed for their registration, NDA, EMA approval. That strategy has been quite a successful strategy for most companies because the largest pharmaceutical markets in the world historically have been the U.S. and Western Europe. And so leaving China for the later part of their development strategy has seemed a reasonable strategy. Within the next 10, 15 years, China will very quickly overtake the pharmaceutical market worldwide and be one of the largest consumers of branded pharmaceuticals in the world. Certainly by late 2020, they will be the number one consumer of pharmaceutical products in the world. And so from a market perspective, China has become much more important from a registration strategy for new drugs. That said, at the same time, over the last number of years, the regulatory authorities in China, the SFDA, have become much more efficient at their review process. So whereas historically we had seen timelines of 12, 18, 24 months for clinical trial application approvals, those timelines have come down significantly for small molecules, hovering closer to 7 to 9 months, kind of 12 months at the outset. So historically, the de facto strategy had always been, let's get our drugs approved in the U.S. and Europe, and then later go back and do China. And that added somewhere between 3 to 5 years to their development strategy to get a drug approved in China. And today, what we're trying to do is convince people that parallel drug development pathways, and including China in their phase 3 development, can actually shave off a number of those years for final Chinese registration approval in addition to their EMA and USA approvals.
Well, that's interesting because I hadn't actually heard that their approval times have come down to 7 to 9 months, so that is pretty significant.
I should say it's important to recognize that there is a difference between small molecules and biologics. So for biologics, we are still in a very lengthy approval process, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 months on average. But for small molecules, we have even seen approvals in as quick as 4.5 months for drugs that are targeting unmet medical needs that are small molecules and that are novel. So there is this belief within the SFDA that drugs that don't have prior approvals, so they have not received an FDA approval or an EMA approval, those drugs receive a priority review. So there is a green light channel for drugs that meet several of these criteria: unmet medical need, not approved anywhere else in the world, small molecule. And those are drugs that we seem to have the most success with getting relatively rapid approval, certainly comparable approvals with many other countries in the world now, although the submission process can be much more complicated.
And you said the development is in parallel in a phase 3 program, or is there an early planning process to this parallel development pathway that improves the ultimate drug marketing in China?
There are a number of pathways. Every discussion with the SFDA is really individualized, so it can vary. In the general concept, there is your global drug development program, which is standard for most companies, which is phase 1 safety study somewhere in the U.S. or Western Europe, and then a phase 2, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B, and then approval. In including China as part of your phase 3 development, what you can do is, if you have enough time in your recruitment process to absorb the 7 to 12 months that it will take for the clinical trial approval, you can file your phase 3 trial in China to include Chinese sites as part of your global phase 3 trial. If you also accrue at least 100 pairs of patients, which is fairly standard for the small molecule studies, those 200 patients as part of your phase 3 can support your registration in China. So it becomes part of a inclusive parallel strategy. At the same time, for your phase 3 sites in China, you may want to explore and work with the SFDA to collect a subset of those patients for a PK analysis to submit as part of your safety. So there is the ability, if you have enough patients in China and if you include safety, that once your trial is done, you filed it in the U.S. or Europe, and you have your CPP, or Certificate of Pharmaceutical Product Approval, somewhere else in the world, you can then go back to the Chinese authorities and file all of that data you collected from the Chinese sites for Chinese registration. And that will shave several years off that process for the Chinese registration. So basically, it becomes somewhat of a simultaneous global development. That's different than doing a Chinese drug development strategy. So that approval would be for the pharma company to then import that approved drug into China for sale, which is different from registering as a domestic company where your manufacturing would be done in China.
How does the parallel registration work? Do you literally just file it with the EMA, the FDA, and the SFDA at the same time?
For your phase 3 approval strategy, where you're just adding phase 3 sites in China with 100 pairs of patients, it's generally just like any other country in the world. So you're filing your CTA, your clinical trial approval, with the SFDA to have those Chinese sites participate, and they would review that package like any of the regulatory authorities around the world. The other parallel process that can be done and has been done by a number of companies is, if you know your general protocol design for your phase 3, you're just missing a dose, for an example, so you haven't completed your phase 2 dose finding studies, you do have the potential to file your phase 3 study in China as part of your CTA prior to the completion of your phase 2 study, and then go back and amend the phase 3 process in the CTA that you filed with the Chinese government. So if your phase 2 is almost complete and you know there's going to be a 9 to 12 month lag time for approval for your CTA in China, you do have that potential to go ahead and file early if it's just going to be amending dose. And that could save several months on your final approval in China as well. It's a riskier strategy in that it costs $150,000 or $200,000 for that filing. So if for some reason your phase 2 data turns out to be negative and you don't move ahead with your phase 3, you would have sunk those costs into your clinical trial application with SFDA. But on the flip side, if you go ahead and make that investment and it saves you several months, well worth it.
When it gets down to the people on the ground, project managers or the clinical ops, what do they need to know about the parallel development, how it affects them and their decisions or their operations?
So for most companies, the challenge is the regulatory package, so the filing of the CTA within China, as well as feasibility to ensure that the patient population exists, that it matches the standard of care or customary care that is within the protocol. Also, the importation of comparator drug, the exportation of samples, if you need pharmacokinetics or specialty labs done. The clinical teams need to understand the complexities of all of that and the additional time required for all of those processes. All of that impacts overall clinical trial development timeline and is part of the initial planning process. So the clinical project teams need to work with partners that really understand all of the implications of each of those things in China and how they impact the timeline. And then, in addition to that, the CMC portion of the filing for your CTA is very, very challenging within China. For biologics especially, the SFDA is quite restrictive in the amount of information that they require sponsor companies to provide. For small molecules, many companies may not have their final product manufacturing completed in order to take advantage of kind of parallel development, kind of the early phase 2 strategy I discussed. Certainly by phase 3, that's all figured out. So you really need to work closely with your CMC folks. So the clinical project teams who may be used to in the U.S. or in Europe kind of focusing solely on the clinical part of the package need to work very closely because the CMC part of the package for the SFDA CTA filing is equally important as the clinical plan.
And that's a change for them. Or technology, what is the best practices around doing the parallel development that you're talking about?
I would say that your CRO partner, if they have the experience in China, is really kind of the hub to all of the spokes. So whether it is the importation of drug and the importation licenses, whether it is the export of genetic material or blood samples, or trying to coordinate a local lab, whether it's logistics shipping of cold chain supply material or samples that need to be treated and then exported. All of those pieces, central lab requirements, central ECG requirements, electronic patient-reported outcome equipment, electronic data capture, all of those pieces really should be managed quite closely by the CRO that you have on the ground in China because it is so complex and because there are so many things that need to be done just right in order to ensure that the data capture can substantiate the claims the client is making for approval. So really your key is managing locally on the ground. Now, it's not to say that lots of our pharma partners manage different pieces of that separately. I think that it's just more efficient within China to ensure that you have kind of one voice that is communicating how all those processes will work to the sites. The process of true parallel development with registration is a relatively new concept, and so I think it's important to find drug companies that are willing to make that investment up front. And I think that that is probably the biggest challenge for CRO companies right now who are trying to help their partner sponsor companies really take advantage of the ability to shave off months and months of time for their Chinese registration. I think that that will just come over time as more and more clients are educated.
Excellent. Thank you, Kent.
Happy to help.